Hello and welcome to the 7th video retrospective review of our marathon of the Final Fantasy series and our walkthrough of the year of the JRPG, as we ask the question, why should you play Final Fantasy VII? I've always considered the second half of the 1990s to be a little bit of a cursed time for video games. Not because there were no brilliant video games that came out in this era, but because graphically the Nintendo 64, the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn were video game consoles that just didn't produce games that look as good as the games that came on the previous console generation. The early growing pains of 3D graphics was a very difficult time for the gaming medium. Some new franchises spawned which were absolutely brilliant and they figured out how to work within this era. But of the game series that had thrived in the growth and slow growth from 8-bit to 16-bit two-dimensional pixel art video games, only a few video game series actually made that transition successfully and without losing something very fundamental along the progress. Of the series that made the transition, none of them did it anywhere near as well as Final Fantasy. By jumping away from Nintendo and towards Sony, using CD-ROMs in a game that actually was packed across multiple CDs, so you played it across disc 1, then disc 2, disc 3, they were able to tell a story that was larger in scope than anything in the series that came before. But they also had to make a lot of sacrifices. So this is a very early three-dimensional video game. It cuts so many corners that if it was made today, would brand it absolutely scathing reviews. It does this because of when it was made, because of the early timeline of the technology. And there's things that it does that you consider unforgivable if you were looking at a video game and judging it critically. The largest thing is that the majority of the characters and the enemies and the bosses that you will fight, they are very crude, very amorphous, very bizarre three-dimensional models. I actually really appreciate some of the inventiveness and the wildness that this game brings to it. But the majority of the creatures that you'll fight, the textures that come across them are very bland and very basic. The design is in the conception and the inspiration for these creatures. Technically, they're deficient. This is even more obvious on the world map and when your characters are moving around outside of battle, because it's actually doing LEGO a disservice to say that Cloud, Squall, Tifa, Sephiroth, all the characters that Final Fantasy VII is so memorable for, look like they're made of LEGO. This is so basic, so simplified. The characters are cartoonish dolls with only vague approaches to a human proportions. Yet, Squaresoft was able to manipulate and move these very simple models around in such a way that they could tell an extremely engaging and varied storyline. So, if you can forgive the technical deficiencies, if you can forgive that this is one of the earliest full 3D games in the series, one of the first full successful 3D games across games consoles, if you can look past the blank, emotionless faces and the strange, bulbous limbs attached to these characters as they go through their various conniptions, there's a lot to love here. Because all of the effort that Squaresoft and the designers of the Final Fantasy team didn't put into making this game look technically beautiful, they used into telling one of the most magnificent, one of the most well-realised, one of the most expertly paced video game stories, and designing a combat system that was based upon what existed in Final Fantasy V and VI, but a combat system that levels and grinds and pulls you through the game in the most rewarding way this series has ever done. Final Fantasy VII gets so much right that it seems churlish to criticise the graphics. It seems churlish to comment upon how primitive the technology, how simple the graphics are. It's probably, anyone who gives this game the time of day, probably about a 10 to 15 minute adjustment window where your expectations on just how the game looks need to be tempered and set to the right level to try and find a mindset of what other video games look like in 1996. And once you've done that, you realise that actually, for all of its deficiencies now, at the time it really was beautiful. Whilst the characters and the humans that you play as look very simplified, the backgrounds are extravagant and beautiful, because only the characters and the monsters of this game are three-dimensional characters. most of the game exists in a painted-on world. Rather than try and realise a full three-dimensional environment, Square modelled and then rendered large pictures of a range of varieties of places that the characters walk around in. There is still a world map, but you don't unlock it until you're several hours into the game and leave the first city of Midgar. For the majority of the game, you'll be walking through these painted, computer-rendered environments which depict doorways and treasure chests and other environmental factors that you can interact with, and by and large, this was a triumph. I would say potentially one of the reasons that the game focused so much on a dark, grungy environment of a depressed post-steampunk city of Midgar is that metal walkways, sheets and dark sewers rendered really well with the technology of the time. But when the game wants to get a little bit creative, when it wants to show you vast, beautiful sunsets or towering snowstorms, it usually looks pretty good. There's a great variety in this game. It just takes you a good 5 or 6 hours to start encountering that, because for the first 4 or 5 hours of the game, you'll be stuck inside the city of Midgar. And that's not a criticism, because the city of Midgar is a wonderful place to start this game. And when they eventually started remaking Final Fantasy VII, it doesn't surprise me that they created an entire part 1 of a 3-part video game, essentially had a full 40 to 50 hour AAA remake that just remade this portion of the game, because Midgar is an incredible science fiction creation. A futuristic science fiction city powered on a magical energy force which is harvested from the ground, where the rich and the affluent and the business class live on top of this floating metal plate, enjoying all the wealth that this brings them, whereas the underclass and the poor live underneath the plate, with the sun and the sky completely blocked out from them. They live in perpetual darkness with just the skylights pointing down on them to give some semblance where they eke out a living. The main storyline where the game starts, you play as a group of eco-terrorists. You play as the dispossessed who live beneath the plate, striking back against the people above you, striking against the evil corporate capitalists who are manipulating the situation and who don't realise or seem to appreciate that this magical energy force that they're harvesting up isn't infinite, that they're harming the planet, that ultimately we're all going to suffer because of the pollution and the damage that they're inflicting to the world around them without a care in the world. This introduction setting, the game starts already underway with a active terrorism mission, with your main character Cloud Strife recruited to join Avalanche to strike back against the Shundra Empire, already underway, with beautiful, evocative music from Nobuo Uematsu, and that first active mission that ends with the bombing of a Mako refinery being a brilliant scene to introduce the combat setting, to introduce the characters, and to introduce the conflict that this game will be set around. However, that conflict doesn't hold for the entire game. But the gameplay, I haven't talked much about that because honestly, it plays like Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy V did. One of the reasons the Final Fantasy series made the transition into 3 dimensions so successfully is because Squaresoft changed almost nothing. They reduced the number of characters you can control in battle from 4 to 3. This actually speeds up the combat a little bit. It gives you more variety. It means that the active time gauge, the cooldown between each of your actions feels quicker, and you have less time to respond to enemy attacks. The characters do have distinct differences. Barrett, as a character with a gun attached to his arm, naturally can sit in the back row and shoot from afar. Magic wielders can sit in the back row. By being retreated away from the enemies, you are protected a little bit from the majority of enemy attacks. Your characters can survive for longer. Whereas Cloud and Tifa and Red, characters who engage in melee combat with a sword, with their fists, with their claws respectively, they need to get up close, but they will suffer more damage in return. That's a really simple system that Final Fantasy has had for a long time, and the only major change, as I said, is reducing the number of characters to 3. The characters do have these small differentiations, the main one being their limit breaks. So when they suffer damage in battle, when characters attack you, you start building up what's called a limit gauge. And when this limit gauge fills up, it allows you to respond with an ultra powerful attack. Now these attacks can momentarily change the format of the battle. They can power your characters up. Aerith can heal, whereas Cloud exclusively deals damage. And they look visually stunning. I would say that I suffered a little bit, probably because I just played 6 other Final Fantasy games in very close succession. The pacing of Final Fantasy VII's combat system hurt me a little bit. I think overall the pacing is fine. The battles are fast, energetic, but between selecting a command, I want the character to attack an enemy, I then had to sit and watch as the characters physically went through those motions, and it took a little longer than I was expecting, and that's probably because in two-dimensional pixel art games, they just jumped across the screen and hit. Whereas I was getting really annoyed watching the wind-up time as the characters would move into strike position, run forward, dash forward, take the hit, and then retreat back to their positions between each movement. Probably, as I said, I think if you hadn't just played 6 other two-dimensional Final Fantasy games beforehand, it wouldn't bother you, but I was actually a little bit sad about how slow the game felt when I initially transitioned into it. By the end of the game, I think I'd adjusted to the combat system. Most modern ports do give you a ability to speed up the characters, but I don't think that's a good way of playing the game. You don't feel connected at all. It feels like you're watching a video if you play it on speed up, so I don't recommend overusing that feature. Despite how simple the graphic looks, the combat look brilliant. The camera is probably my biggest complaint because it spins madly around the battlefield and quite often clips through series of the background, meaning that your vision of what you're fighting is actually quite obscured. However, the system is really simple. The limit breaks actually give you some reward for taking damage. They change the pace of the battle, but the ultimate success has to be the innovation of the materia system. Now, I praised Final Fantasy VI for letting you equip different espers to unlock different magic spells, and Final Fantasy VII disconnects the summoning aspect from that, but keeps the concept. Every weapon you equip in this game will have a different number of materia slots. Now, these slots are where you apply different stones that you can collect throughout the game. Some stones give you the magical ability to heal, some of them give you offensive capabilities, some of them unlock side bonuses like the ability to move twice, the ability to steal from enemies, the ability to inflict a large amount of damage but from the back row, which means you can protect Cloud or Tifa, who normally have to be up close and suffer more damage, by putting them at the back. There's only a certain number of slots, and as you progress through the game, you're not just getting stronger and stronger weapons and armour, you're getting weapons and armour that can have more materia slots. So there's a tactical decision to be made. Do you value your variety and offensive capabilities of having a large number of materia slots that mean your characters will have more capabilities, or do you want a small number of materia slots, but high value stats, which means you can deal more damage and take more damage before your characters suffer? The latter approach will severely limit you, because you don't learn the abilities in the materia, you can only cast the spells when you have the materia equipped. I also really like that they changed the ability to cast spells on multiple enemies to be a materia item in itself, the all materia. So previously, a lot of the previous games, when you advanced through them, you became extremely overpowered when you reached the point in the game where you could cast a Fire spell to essentially engulf all of the enemies in the battlefield in one spell in one turn, take them all out. Final Fantasy VII adjusts this by giving you an all materia, but the first time you get it, you'll only be able to use the spell once per battle. Which means, yes, you can target multiple enemies, but you can only do it once. As you grind and unlock and power up that materia, you'll get the ability to use it 2, 3 and more times per battle. This is really useful if an enemy uses an attack that will hurt all of your characters. You can heal them all in one go, rather than having to heal them one at a time, all the whilst you're suffering more damage. Everything in the combat system of Final Fantasy VII just balances beautifully. The choices of what materia you have equipped to what characters in what combination at a time, whether you put characters in the front or back row, whether you have a large number of material or small amounts of materia, all of it is completely under your control at all times. The main downsides are things that there are a lot of missable items in this game, some of them extremely obvious, but if you want the summons, the ability to call forth powerful monsters to fight alongside you, to do a very devastating attack against your enemies, you can miss quite a lot of those summons if you don't explore the right place at the right time. But other than that, the only other criticism I've got is the graphics. It looks like a game that was released in 1997, and that takes a little bit of readjustment to your expectations about how it's meant to look and feel compared to a modern video game perspective. There are probably 4 or 5 different sets of antagonists that you'll be facing in a major sense across this game. Initially, it's you versus Shinra. It's you versus the people who are polluting the planet and destroying the world and have created this unjust society. However, you eventually discover that Shinra had a rogue soldier called Sephiroth who turned against them and is up to his own nefarious ends that potentially could destroy the entire planet. Sephiroth is the most famous villain in Final Fantasy series. I praised Kefka when I looked at Final Fantasy VI, and Squaresoft clearly thought they were onto a winner because Sephiroth is everything Kefka was and amped up to the next level of coolness. He's dark, he's mysterious. The entire game, once you leave Midgar, is framed as a chase. The majority of Final Fantasy VII is you pursuing Sephiroth around the planet. That's your guide. That's your reason for travelling. You go, after you leave Midgar, you go from city to city, hunting Sephiroth down, constantly seeing signs that he's been there, constantly seeing signs of the devastation and the murder that he's wreaked upon the people around him. Sephiroth is bad news, and Cloud has a personal vendetta against him because of what went on 5 years ago. There's a beautiful twist concerning Sephiroth, however, that I don't want to spoil in this video. He has a lot of depth, but most of it is hidden and not really shown to you unless you stop and think and pause about the video game. Because one of the major themes of Final Fantasy VII is that it has an untrustworthy narrator. Cloud is a initially very aggressive, very abrupt, very unlikable person. This has led to a lot of spin-out media depicting him as moody, a sulky individual. I don't think that's the case at all. Cloud is actually a very driven person, but at the start of the game, he's just been through some emotional torment that it takes a very long time for you to unpick and understand what went on in his life that led him to become a rogue mercenary wandering the streets of Midgar, that led him to be picked up by Tifa and recruited into Avalanche. She recruited him into this terrorist cell to look out for him because she was worried about her childhood friend. After you leave Midgar, Cloud recounts a story about his previous encounter with Sephiroth, the thing that kicked off the storyline of the game, and not everything that he tells you is completely trustworthy. And Tifa knows that a lot of what he tells you is not trustworthy, but because she's worried about Cloud, she can't challenge him upon it. There's a theme of trust here, of the main characters hiding things from each other. Usually, compared to a lot of other video games that go down this trope, there's very good reasons they're hiding them. One of the characters that recruits to join your party as you travel through this video game, recruiting people to join you in your combat to fight against the Shinra, one of them is out and out a Shinra spy. And he tells you very early on, I'm not a real person, I'm a robot being employed by a very high level Shinra employee, and I'm here to spy upon you. But there are very good reasons that you shouldn't stop me spying upon you, because if you do, something really nasty is going to happen, so just let me tag along and put up with me, okay? You don't want to suffer the consequences if you turn against me. And I think that character is actually really hated by the majority of the fans, but conceptually I really like it. It's an excellent twist, and it ties into Barrett and his family and his reason for hating Shinra and why he set up and joined in this terrorist cell. It settles into Red 13, the only non-human character that you recruit, who is tasked with looking after the planet and also detests Shinra. But his reasons are much more recent, because he was kidnapped by the scientist Hojo and attempted to be experimented on. Hojo is the third of these main antagonists. Although he's initially an employee of Shinra, he goes rogue. He's actually very linked into Sephiroth and the reason that their super soldier, ultimate mercenary, turned into a villain. Hojo has his own agenda. He's up to his own thing. He's a maniacal scientist who has links to Cloud, who has links to Sephiroth, who is chasing Aerith, the young girl that you recruit, who has ancient historical connections and a magical power, and Hojo wants to kidnap her and breed her so he can experiment on her offspring. It's a truly dark and despicable person, but when you start to unpick what Hojo is, what he's done, the despicable things he's done, he may actually be the true villain of Final Fantasy VII. Because Sephiroth is literally his creation, his offspring, a mutant super monster that he loosed upon the world, and although yes, the planet may end and all life may perish under Sephiroth's machinations, Hojo doesn't care. He's proud of his creation. He wants to see how far this can go. It's all just a grand experiment to this evil man. And beyond Hojo, there's actually origin of all of this, the ephemeral, uncertain villain, Jenova. Jenova is a life form that Hojo is experimenting on. It's got very mysterious origins that are just even more science fiction than they are fantasy. The super soldiers that Hojo has been creating, people such as Cloud, your main character, and Sephiroth, your main antagonist, are infused with Jenova cells. It's this alien component injected upon them that gives them their superpowers, that makes them as powerful as they are. But the original creature Jenova is still around. It still exists, and it has an extremely important role in the history of this world and why it is the way it is. The world of Final Fantasy VII is one that had an ancient race of people who lived in relative peace and harmony and had a prophecy about the promised land that they would go to when you found peace with the planet. Some very high-level people of Shinra are searching for that promised land and have authorized and paid for these experiments to create these monsters and these creatures because they want to find these ancient people, and they want to find the promised land where they believe there'll be infinite Mako energy. It's a renewable energy source. They don't need to continue harming the planet. They can live in their wealth and comfort, using up as much energy as they could possibly want without a care in the world about the damage they're doing. Their search for the promised land is a fool's errand, but you can see why they would want it. The ancient people only have one living descendant left over, Aerith, who joins your team as one of your main magic users early on in the game, and she's got a tragic story with one of the most spoiled endings in video game history. But Aerith is really important because of her connection to the ancient Cetra people. Hojo wants her for that connection, but he also wanted Jenova for her connection, because Jenova, who was initially thought to be one of the ancient people, no, she is a parasitic alien from another planet. She is an amorphous shapeshifter who can adopt any form Jenova wants to adopt. Jenova can trick you. Jenova can pretend to be something that she's not. She can talk to your mind. She can deceive you. She can make you see things that aren't real, cast you temporarily into a world of illusion while she sneaks in to make the kill. Jenova is dangerous, and early on in the game, after spending 5 years trapped in an experimental cage in Hojo's laboratory, Jenova is set free to wreak havoc on the planet again. And so, this is just a wonderful setup. The layering of the different bad guys is something that Final Fantasy series had never done before. You're set against Shinra for the protection of the planet. Shinra have these arch mercenaries they set after you called the Turks, who are the more personable villains who actually talk to you and have this wonderful storyline themselves. So Shinra and the Turks. Ultimately, the major villain is Sephiroth and his world-ending machinations. But supporting Sephiroth from afar, they're not collaborating. This is just a grand experiment that Hojo set loose and is delighted to see the outcome. You have Hojo, who also has been setting loose Jenova. That's 5 villains, 5 sets of enemies that you play through this game in constant conflict of them, and they're wonderfully balanced. They give you a constant drive to level up your characters, to engage in random battles, to power up Cloud, to power up Tifa, Barret, and save the world. Because if you don't do anything, Final Fantasy VII is also an apocalyptic game. Previous games literally showed how the world would end, but I've never felt such a sense of foreboding as Final Fantasy VII offered. The means by which the world is going to be destroyed, a giant meteor, which is actually in the logo and the main theme of the game. It's coming. You can see it in the sky. You can see it descending, and all life on this planet will end if it makes contact with the ground. That's the setting of Final Fantasy VII. There's so much more to it. I don't want to go into deep spoilers, but this game tells a story in a way that very few video games are capable of. Its pacing is a little bit quick, a little bit abrupt. As I said, when they remade this game, started remaking it, the entire Midgar section, which is just the first 3 hours of a 25-hour plus adventure, were filled an entire disc where they added a lot of complications that I don't think necessarily improve the narrative, because there's a lot of simplicity, there's a lot of streamlinedness to what's going on in the original game. Everything is connected. This is the game in the series that started to overdo it a little bit when it comes to mini-games. I don't think any of the ones in Final Fantasy VII are too offensive. There's a whole side quest regarding chocobo breeding that could be a time sink if you really want to breed the most powerful, the fastest, and the most capable chocobo to engage in races in the Gold Saucer, a giant disco-like place where you can earn money and unlock powerful abilities and items by engaging a load of these minigames. You are only forced to engage in most of these minigames once: chocobo racing, chase on a motorbike, skiing down the side of a mountain, and a submarine hunt. So they're relatively inoffensive, they're quite fun to play, but they give you the option of pouring more hours in if you want to unlock the best armour, equipment, or abilities for certain characters. The core cast that you're stuck with, Cloud is almost always in the party, apart from some late games where he temporarily leaves and then comes back, have a wonderful dynamic together, but that's because they're all linked to the story. Barret's hatred of Shinra has a deep and personal background. Tifa's connection to Cloud and why she's concerned and sticks with him has a deep and personal background. Red 13 comes from a very special place, as in her own way does Aerith. Then, as you progress through the game, you'll meet Cid, one of the most unlikable characters in Final Fantasy history, yet strangely endearing. This foul-mouthed old man is actually a natural-born leader, but when you first meet him, he gives you the worst possible first impression anyone could in the way he mistreats his colleagues. The pacing of the game means that once you leave Midgar, you'll essentially travel the world, and most places will have a connection to at least one of your characters, meaning that there is a specific plot point and city of the game where you're dealing with Cid, a specific city where you're dealing with Red 13. And then once you've fully explored the world map and caught up with Sephiroth at the end of this chase, the game will reset and you'll largely have to re-explore the planet a second time. It's not as open world, it's much more structured than the second half of Final Fantasy VI, but you'll revisit some of the places and complete the storylines that started during the first half of the game to complete the character arcs of your cast. There are 2 optional characters who are worth getting the first half of the game to expand your player base a little bit more and give you a little bit more insight into Sephiroth's original origin and the history of Shinra experimenting, and also into the war that Shinra won when they essentially conquered the planet and gave them a monopoly over the world's trade and infrastructure. Final Fantasy VII is always going to be worth your time. I can see though why Square Enix was nervous about it. I can see why they look back at it and say, it looks old, it looks jaded, it looks almost unplayable to a modern audience. It really isn't, but I can completely understand why they were nervous about this relatively untextured, amorphous blob. The amount of creativity, the amount of inspiration, just the scope of the world that Squaresoft created and released in 1997 is amazing. And as much as I actually had a very good time playing the remake, it's a very different game, both in the way it controls, in the way it looks, and the way it paces its storyline. The remake is a much slower game. It takes more time to focus on individual characters and add new characters, not all of which actually adds to the experience. The original has some janky bits, but it tells a beautiful story where everything is connected, where almost no time is wasted because every moment contributes to your understanding of the plot, of your emotional connection to the characters, and there's very little dead waste here. So you should, even if you especially if you enjoyed the remake, you should go back and check out the original Final Fantasy VII. A game so amazing that it could have one ultimate plot twist halfway through the game spoiled, and still have 2 more hidden in reserve, which change everything you think you know about Cloud Strife. And nobody talks about them, because everyone's so focused on the first one, and that's brilliant storytelling.